Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate that. It's a nice introduction. It's important for me to start by just thanking Rangjung Yeshe Institute. Thank all of you for being here. I found RY to be really a wonderful environment for learning and for collegiality. I've really enjoyed learning from Garrett and from Dan and meeting so many of you who are here. If there's anyone who's been holding back, I am always interested to discuss people's research, their interests, and I'm happy to answer questions about the PhD program at Princeton. So come and find me for a chat at lunch at Utpala. We still have like 2 weeks left, so I guess the clock is ticking. I'm going to speak for around 45 minutes, and then hopefully there'll be time for questions. So you can see on your handout, I've got an outline of the presentation. I'm going to go through those headings. Aside from that, I've seen people sort of reading the handout. I'm going to read everything to you on the handout. I don't think that you can figure out what I'm going to say based on the quotations that I've given you. It's just a way for you to follow along. So I'll start just by introducing things. So Buddhist Moral Psychology for Politics. The title of the talk is Applying Buddhist Moral Psychology to Politics. First, notice that roles are optional. So the core of Buddhist philosophy, from one perspective at least, is the idea that everything in experience is impermanent and unreliable, and there's no stable essential self. Buddhists describe the self as a mistaken conceptual construct. The mind generates an appearance of an unchanging subject and agent, even though there is none. All the tragedies of existence boil down to the inevitable suffering that comes from grasping after this image of stability that is mistakenly superimposed upon what is always changing and so ultimately unreliable. Over the last few years, I've been working out how this foundational psychological picture can be seen to provide an instructive guide to a Buddhist approach to the social and the political as well. Central to notice is that the self, that is a conceptual construct, takes the form of identities and roles, which are sociocultural constructs. These identities and roles are also mistakenly taken to be stable and real, just like the self. Buddhists describe the fundamental problem of life as stemming from attachment to our self's existence, which we grasp onto even though we're impermanent and ultimately subject to old age, sickness, and death. And at an existential level, who could deny the importance of facing up to this truth? But also at a very pressing practical level, it is identifying with and grasping after sociocultural roles that more often motivates human activities and is its attachment to reified identities that generates at an interpersonal, social, and political level the ordinary suffering of our lives. Speaking of sociocultural identities in this way applies Buddhist metaphysics to the practical, to the everyday. Buddhist moral psychology in this way provides a bridge between social constructivism and pragmatism while improving on both. You don't need to know these terms all that well, but if you do, then this will be a little helpful section. Social constructivism correctly points out that concepts are contingent and shaped by power, but it often lacks a clear means of normative grounding behind the idea that some constructs are oppressive or unjust. Our Buddhist approach adds a structured ethical lens, distinguishing between constructs that perpetuate defilements, greed-driven capitalist exploitation or something, hate-driven nationalism, delusion-driven gender essentialism, and so on, and those that counter them. Today, I'll be proposing the idea of optionality in politics as a useful construct in this line. Buddhism, in this way, acknowledges social constructivism's critiques of contingency and bias while providing a criterion for evaluating social constructs that's neither relativistic nor based in an external metaphysical absolute, and it's intrinsic to the theory rather than just a kind of arbitrary seeming addition, which you sometimes see. Buddhist epistemology defines concepts as always at some level delusory, but still useful to the extent that they perform a function either in cognition or in the world. And this idea from Buddhist Sema, right, pramana studies, aligns Buddhist approaches with pragmatism, which also grounds concepts in usefulness. Where Buddhism improves upon pragmatism, I'd say, is by providing a robust standard for what counts as useful. Without such a standard, pragmatism is subject to the critique of relativism. Useful for whom and in what sense? Buddhism certainly foregrounds suffering and well-being as empirical data, but Buddhist moral psychology more precisely assesses concepts based on the mental states with which they are associated. So we totally have a dog in here. And in that situation, it's very hard to follow a talk where somebody's reading and there's all these technical terms and you're supposed to hang on to a sentence from the beginning to the end. So that's a little bit distracting, and I understand it. So good luck to everyone. Maybe I'll go back a little bit. Without such a standard, pragmatism is subject to the critique of relativism, useful for whom and in what sense. Buddhism foregrounds suffering and well-being as empirical data, but Buddhist moral psychology more precisely assesses concepts based on the mental states with which they are associated. Do concepts deny and diminish defilements, such as greed, hatred, and self-delusion, or do they arise from and promote instead the positive qualities of compassion, such as lack of bias, or equanimity, which would be non-reactivity, or wisdom, the awareness of what I'm going to call the conventional optional nature of all available positions. This introduces a moral and psychological depth that is missing from traditional pragmatism. In the arena of politics, such a Buddhist-inflected pragmatism would aim to restructure political reasoning, both methodologically and in terms of the questions it addresses. Instead of assuming the equal trustworthiness of options proposed in ostensibly rational deliberation, opinions. So we think of traditional pragmatism or traditional democratic reasoning as just a matter of negotiating between different opinions. Instead of assuming the equal trustworthiness of various opinions proposed in supposedly rational deliberation, views would be assessed at least partly according to their affiliation with defiled or wholesome origins. And instead of simply negotiating compromises between competing interests and powers, a Buddhist-inflected political reasoning might seek perspectives and policies that reduce self-delusive reactivity and polarization and enhance moral clarity and modesty, however that might be turning out to be measurable. So how can we know what views emerge from defilements and what from wholesomeness? How can we know what will bring about greater reactivity and what will enhance modesty? These may be unusual meta-questions for politics, but this is intended as a theory to guide empirically based analysis. The point is not to impose moral judgments ahead of time on political discourse, but to develop tools for systematically assessing how certain views and policies shape mental and social conditions over time. By examining patterns, how particular narratives, political narratives fuel polarization, for instance, or how certain institutional structures encourage greed or fear, or how specific deliberative practices cultivate equanimity or insight, we can generate testable hypotheses about which conditions promote healthier political engagement. This is not about labeling views as inherently defiled or pure, but about identifying the causal dynamics that make some political environments more reactive, more entrenched in craving and aversion, and others more open, more responsive to evidence, and more oriented toward collective well-being. So in what follows, I'll first, in part one, lay out briefly how Buddhist moral psychology explains the way that social identities and roles can work to overwhelm the mind with defilements, and how this dynamic generates negative behavior. I'll emphasize that It's the selective reification of views, the attachment to views, that provides a pivotal moment where the mind becomes captured by socially available but dysfunctional perspectives. And then in part 2, I'll explain how meditation, specifically focusing on mindfulness, serves an ethical purpose for countering this reification and identification by providing distance between the mind and the reification of one of its available perspectives. And then in part 3, as a transition to articulate the political application of the point, we will see that the Buddha's establishment of a community of renunciants serves as a space of social mindfulness, so to speak, simply by displaying that ordinary social identities are optional. One could always give them up and join the Sangha. I'll argue that the foregrounding of this kind of optionality in politics could serve as a tool for highlighting the value of Buddhist-inflected pragmatism. As an example, then, in part 4, I'll discuss how democratic representation is flawed from this perspective to the degree that it operates through abstract ideologies and identities, party identities, for instance, rather than practical, empirically grounded policies. Awareness of the optional character of all perspectives can counter polarization and the rigidity of competitive political perspectives. This revises and expands Dewey's suggestions for educating a democratic electorate. In the conclusion, I'll discuss the question of how to institutionalize optionality through a discussion of public opinion and reflexive governance, but I'll really only have a chance to touch on that. Okay, part 1. So you think I've started? I haven't started yet. Okay, moral psychology for social thought. Everyone behaves badly sometimes, especially when stressed or not paying attention, or when they succumb to social pressure. Buddhist analysis provides a specific focus on the causal dynamics of this situation, where one's better lights are blocked or diverted. It teaches that negative behaviors arise from attachment to a reified self, which invites mental defilements such as greed, hatred, and selfish self-delusion. And these distort the mind's proper moral perception. As a social thesis, I read this to be saying that adhering to stable identities fixes us in inflexible perspectives and harmful reactive attitudes. We act unethically when habitually reified frozen versions of our identities and our roles overwhelm us and occlude our awareness of other perspectives and options. Buddhism aligns with modern psychology in attributing the worst of these self-occlusions, not merely to internal dysfunction, but crucially to social learning. The Buddha describes ordinary social life as governed by the unhealthy operation of the so-called 8 worldly concerns: sensory pleasure and displeasure, fame and infamy, praise and blame, and gain and loss. People are attracted to the first and repelled by the second of each pair, often so powerfully that their perception and thinking are distorted. What makes these concerns worldly is that they index the affairs of the world, of people, of society. So 2 of the 4 pairs, fame and blame, are concerned with nothing but public standing and reputation. So that's obviously social. The others, sensations and possessions, are attributed value in society. We look to the world's opinions to learn how much of and what kind of pleasures are the best. So think of Bentley and Patron and Rolex and so on. The problem is that since worldly concerns create attachment to external validation, they make individuals' experience dependent upon how they're perceived or imagine themselves to be perceived on social norms in general. Desire for social approval and fear of criticism shape identity and behavior, leading to moral compromise in pursuit of status, security, or gratification. Furthermore, the Buddha explains that the moment an object of desire is obtained, it is evaluated, compared, and judged, rather than simply enjoyed. Discontentment reigns, which reinforces jealous acquisitiveness, leading to conflict. Overall, frustrating competitive social dynamics distort ethical reasoning and subvert moral self-control. And there's a great deal more to say about this, but the quote that I'm giving you is, "Whoever enjoys and likes arisen possessions, honor, and popularity is called a mendicant who has swallowed Mara's hook." They've met with tragedy and disaster, and the wicked one can do what he wants with them. Modern psychological research confirms Buddhist moral psychology in recognizing that harmful behaviors arise from distorted perceptions of self and others, which are shaped by social reinforcement and attachment to rigid views. Bullies, to take one example, might seek connection and acceptance, but their approach is dysfunctional because fear is not acceptance. Even when bullies achieve social dominance, they often remain isolated and psychologically insecure. And I can give you the sources for this kind of thing I'm talking about. Research shows that aggressive individuals may be highly ranked in peer groups without being well liked, and that peer groups reinforcing bullying do not shield bullies from long-term psychological and relational harm. In Buddhist terms, bullying behavior reflects an attachment to a narrow, reified view of what constitutes power and social belonging. The behavior is reinforced not only by individual desire, but by collective validation, demonstrating how social systems cultivate moral distortions. It's a dysfunctional but still socially approved form of behavior in various circumstances to dominate others or give in to passions or anger, even when it causes harm. Once socially reinforced patterns of evaluative judgment are available, they arise in the mind to intellectualize, rationalize, and accede to powerful distorting emotions. This is how the so-called defilements, such as greed, hatred, and self-deluding self-aggrandizement, are intertwined with, both supports of and supported by, the selective reification of inherited social forms. This is what the Buddha termed attachment to views. The root defilement of ignorance, or moha, thus understood, resembles the psychoanalytic concept of denial, along with other defense mechanisms. Cognitive behavioral approaches articulate this as the maladaptive use of cognition in the pursuit of avoidant coping. The influential psychologist Albert Bandura demonstrated that a great many misbehaviors partake of what he terms moral disengagement, according to which, via a range of cognitive strategies, moral self-regulation is suspended while one carries out activities one otherwise considers wrong. Such concepts provide moral cover for rationalizations at the interpersonal, social, or political level. Leo Tolstoy, who is also Buddhist-inspired, wrote about them in the second epilogue of War and Peace. He says, "These justifications release those who produce the events from moral responsibility. These temporary aims are like a broom fixed in front of a locomotive to clear the snow from the rails in front. They clear men's moral responsibilities from their path." So Bandura, Tolstoy, and other moral disengagement theorists focus on the specific content of rationalizations that people draw from society and use to avoid self-condemnation. The Buddhist perspective highlights the general character of attachment to reified views as the core dysfunction. The point is that when we are calm, we can see that our rationalizations are motivated by dysfunctional emotional states. When we're in those emotional states, the rationalizations are just what we think. This explains why meditation and other strategies that provide spaces for introspective awareness can be morally beneficial. In recognizing the impermanence and conditioned nature of our identities, our desires, and our social structures, Buddhism offers a way to break free from the reactive cycles and move toward ethical clarity and compassion. That's part one. Part two, mindfulness against conceptual reification. The Brahmin Akosaka Bharadwaja was the rudest of the Bharadwaja brothers, each of whom challenged the Buddha and bested him, and was bested by him, rather, became his follower, and attained liberation as an arhat. So they're all really rude, terrible guys, but they all end up arhats. The Samyutta Nikaya records that Bharadwaja insulted the Buddha in harsh language, to which the Buddha replied with the following stratagem that I gave you in the handout. "What do you think, Brahman? Do friends and colleagues, relatives and kin and guests still come to visit you?" "Sometimes they do, worthy Gautama. "Do you serve them with fresh and cooked foods and savories?" "Sometimes I do." "But if they don't accept it, Brahman, who does it belong to?" "In that case, it still belongs to me." In the same way, Brahman, when you abuse, harass, and attack us, who do not abuse, harass, and attack, we don't accept it. It still belongs to you, Brahman. It still belongs to you. Someone who, when abused, harassed, and attacked, abuses, harasses, and attacks in return, is said to eat the food and have a reaction to it. But we neither eat your food nor do we have a reaction to it. It still belongs to you, Brahman. It still belongs to you. So what does it mean to refuse to accept abuse and scolding? It's the same logic as the children's rhyme, I'm rubber, you're glue. What you say bounces off me and sticks to you. The Buddha never partakes in abuse. His mind, consequently, has no insult receptors, so to speak. The Buddha's is a special state of mind, of course. Ordinary people are immediately captured by insults. Normally, harsh words trigger a combative response. The Buddha's reply shows that he sees beyond Bharadwaja's words to his needs as a disciple. This is indeed what allows the Buddha to win him over. By explaining how he distances himself from abusive language, the Buddha creates space in which Bharadwaja becomes able to separate himself from his own reactive attitude, his anger. When the Buddha displays impassivity, not reacting to things that would tempt, enrage, or terrify ordinary beings, this is a model for how a Buddhist should approach language and other conceptual formations in the mind. We don't have to play the game that the mind presents for us. We don't have to be captured by the implications of others' language and conduct or our own. We don't have to jump into all the disputations available, stimulated by socially available conceptual structures, all the excuses. In order to respond to speech effectively, we need mental control that can quarantine the language and analyze it without the process triggering a spontaneous reaction to its implicit linguistic intentions. In order to manage our deluded mind, patience and self-awareness are among the most important Buddhist virtues. We're enjoined to be attentive and mindful, which is to say, to generate mental space to examine our minds before allowing our karmic formations to propel us into actions. In formal mindfulness cultivation practices, meditators notice their mental tendencies and prevent them from causing trouble, at least temporarily, by restraining themselves and becoming, as Śāntideva says, like a block of wood in the next quote. My mind seeks acquisitions, reverence, or renown, or again, wants an audience and attention. Therefore, I remain like a block of wood. My mind longs to hold forth, averse to the good of others, seeking my own advantage, longing only for a congregation. Therefore, I remain like a block of wood. It's intolerant, idle, cowardly, impudent, also foul-mouthed. It's biased in my own favor. Therefore, I remain like a block of wood. So the mind, in its ordinary processes, is selfish and full of heedless cravings. Mindfulness creates the space for introspective awareness, drawing into attention the mind's ordinary operations with all their biases and reactive dysfunctions. Notice Śāntideva's clever discursive separation between the me, the implied author, resting in a moment of mindful self-awareness, and my mind. Ordinarily, we're captured by our mind's presentations, attached, as the Buddha says, to our false self-constructions, but we do not need to identify with everything that our mind presents. Thoughts thrive on mental attention, but if we don't nurse them, their intrinsic energy runs out. The Buddha compares the ordinary mind's thinking processes with its tendencies to attachment and aversion to a man throwing ever more fuel on a bonfire. The more you think about things you want or things you hate, the more your cravings and attachments grow. So the practice of mental restraint, cultivated by determined focus on the breath or some other neutral object, for instance, deprives thoughts and motivations of the fuel they need to capture the mind. This provides a potential window of opportunity through which one can watch thoughts and motivations arise and fall without engaging with them. When you act like a block of wood and don't act on them, the ideas eventually get the message and stop poking themselves up at importune moments. As the glare of the one reified perspective diminishes, the wider space of available options come into view. Where it's reification that narrows moral perception and drives reactive immoral behavior, meditation of this kind counters this habitual self-serving attachment to views and the maladaptive reactivity that it produces. As we've seen, morally detrimental mental distortions are constituted through the reification or essentialization of specific self-serving conceptions. The self-awareness and self-skepticism that Buddhist meditative practices foment are morally significant psychological transformations. Notice finally the humor in the Buddha's response to Bharadwaja through persistent and repeated noticing. Mindfulness that starts as an antidote to attachment to views can ripen into a kind of lightness or playfulness with regard to perspectives and identities. The lightness with which views are held consequently allows a wider range of otherwise contradictory perspectives to be entertained. Buddhist narratives and imagery can be seen to cultivate this perception of play, a figurative sense of life itself as a performance or a game, with endless creative possibility emerges as one grows better able to see the optional nature of ideas and the delusive nature of allowing oneself to be exclusively identified with any one of them. Okay, so part 3, the optionality of political orders, getting to the point. To say that views are optional is to say that no single perspective has claim to the whole truth. Last year, maybe this is a year and a half ago, I was at a dinner where the topic of Israel-Palestine came up and conflicting opinions were voiced, many of them thoughtful and nuanced, from a dizzyingly diverse range of perspectives. While at the same time at the table, there was a scholar who had lived in Israel and worked researching Israeli politics for 2 decades. Since he'd kept silent, I asked him whether asking for his perspective would turn a nice dinner into a busman's holiday for him. And what he said after a pause was that there was truth in what each person was saying. This, I'm submitting, is actually the culminating result of expertise in almost every arena. He's not just sort of skirting the point. He's seeing the benefits of all the different perspectives. It's always more complicated than surface appearances make it out to be. Knowledge expands your awareness of what you don't know faster than it expands your knowledge. At the same time, our imperfect perspectives exist for a reason and generally carry a beneficial practical lesson. The position we're adducing here and calling Buddhist is that this meta-awareness, which habituates epistemic humility, makes us naturally humble, can be productive in itself. I read the Buddha's rejection of attachment to views as a skeptical counter to the extremes of ideology in all of its forms. Today, our politics is poisoned by polarization and prejudice. Buddhist thought provides methods for overcoming such self-delusions, both at the individual and the cultural level. So the Buddha's recommendation of skepticism and humility about views is not just personal ethics, it is socio-political. Consider the story at the opening of the Sāmaññaphala Sutta, where the doubting king Ajatasattu asked the Buddha to explain the point of the renunciant's life. And I didn't give you this. I'm just going to tell you the story. Every profession has a purpose and a benefit that's plain for all to see, the king asks. It makes their parents happy. What's the benefit of the renunciant's life? The Buddha makes some kind of snarky points in response. He says that the first benefit of a renunciant's life is that a servant to the king could leave service when they join the Sangha. And a second benefit is that the tributary to the king's treasury could stop having to pay if he joins the Sangha. And then, as his main answer, he describes the whole path to liberation. And all of this is generally read as a benefit for the individual renunciant, but not really for society as a whole. But perhaps the Buddha wasn't merely evading the king's wider question of the benefit to society. Maybe the Buddha's statements that a servant and a taxpayer could escape their service, and that indeed anyone who wanted to pursue a meaningful life geared toward freedom were really intended, who wanted, could pursue, I just read my sentence wrong. Anyone who wanted could pursue a meaningful life geared toward freedom. That was really intended to point up this worldly benefit that renunciation presents for all of society. How might all of society benefit from there being renunciants who do no obviously productive work and only pursue moral and soteriological goals? Perhaps simply from the public display of the fact that social roles are not immutable, from people knowing that social structures are optional. For one thing, if renunciation is a reasonably appealing, available option, maybe kings can't be overly harsh to their servants or their subjects, lest they lose them. Under this reading, what the Buddha said might have been challenging enough to the king's claim to power that a polite teacher might hesitate to say it directly, and a self-absorbed king might miss it. That is, renunciation presents an alternative social structure that disrupts the inevitability of despotic power and hence tempers its claim to exclusiveness and comprehensiveness. Recognizing the optional character of social identities challenges the tendency to essentialize political orders and systems. Though here it's not possible to survey them, the vast majority of academic approaches in the humanities and social sciences support the idea that social systems and roles are not fixed, natural, or inevitable, but contingent and revisable. History, as a humanistic discipline, does not merely chronicle events, but demonstrates how choices and attitudes make things go one way or the other, and how they can always change. Similarly, social criticism, racial criticism, gender, and other forms of analysis exposes the contingency of social identities and structures, revealing that oppressive systems are not natural or necessary, but sustained by habitual attachment and reification. Whatever our identities and roles, be they interpersonal, familial, regional, or national, associated with heritage, affiliation, appearance, or capability, they're constituted through contingent factors and cause special trouble to the extent that they're taken to be more than potentially useful fictions. Kate Mann's analysis of misogyny from her book Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny illustrates this well. She defines misogyny not as an ideology, but as an enforcement mechanism, punishing individuals for failing to conform to their assigned roles. Under this framework, systemic oppression, whether it's Jim Crow laws or lynchings or sexual violence or spousal abuse, they function not simply as discrimination, but as a means of reifying identities through coercion. One of the dangers of Trump-era politics is that it reaffirms racial and gender hierarchies, to say nothing of nation of origin, as official and authorized, reviving enforcement mechanisms that civil rights protections in America had rendered legally unacceptable. David Graeber and David Wengrow, in their book, The Dawn of Everything, which I do have on the handout, highlight how seasonal variation in cultural forms among pre-colonial societies in the Americas would have made it obvious to participants that identities and social roles could shift. As they described the freedoms that characterized early human societies, here's the quote: "The freedom to abandon one's community, knowing one will be welcomed in faraway lands, the freedom to shift back and forth between social structures depending on the time of the year, the freedom to disobey authorities without consequence, all appear to have been simply assumed among our distant ancestors, even if most people find them barely conceivable today." So this idea directly contrasts with the rigidification of property and authority that emerged later in history. They reference Rousseau's famous claim that civilization began when one man enclosed land and declared, "This is mine," persuading others to accept his claim. This moment, the reification of ownership, is for Rousseau the true beginning of civil society as a system of entrenched inequality. But a parallel can be found in the Aganya Sutta, which describes the origins of governance in pragmatic terms as well. The Buddha explains how food storage led to private property, which in turn created the need for protection, ultimately resulting in the appointment of a king. And like Graeber and Wengrow, the Buddha's account emphasizes that social and political structures are contingent human creations rather than natural or eternal truths. Social identities and political systems could have been otherwise and may yet be changed. This insight is politically significant. Political systems should serve changing human needs rather than rigidly preserving inherited structures. To treat governance as an evolving pragmatic practice rather than an immutable system aligns with both Buddhist thought and historical anthropology, reinforcing the idea that political forms and social identities are choices and not inevitabilities. Okay, we're up to part 4, democratic representation under Buddhist-inspired pragmatism. The key idea behind the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness is that our concepts, so I'm just going to tell you guys what that is. Wish me luck. Is that our concepts tend to simplify, reify, and obscure complex dynamic processes. Concepts name fixed entities, but the world is in constant flux. Objects, bodies, identities, and political institutions only appear stable because they're sustained through repetitive affirmation. When unexpected problems arise, we should consider whether we have been deceived by a surface picture, rather than adverting to causes and conditions. We can apply this to the current crisis in the United States as across the world faced by democratic systems in the turn toward increased populism and media manipulation. Democratic representation ought to serve the electorate and keep it satisfied that its concerns are being heard. Populist revolt suggests that this is not happening in the way things appear, which presents the possibility of an illusion of fairness and equality that conceals structural distortions. To reveal the character of these distortions, let us remind ourselves why elections appear legitimate. What connects a ballot cast in a voting booth to the fairness of representation? In theory, elected representatives should be responsive to their constituents because their political survival depends upon it. Alexander Hamilton articulated this assumption in Federalist 35, arguing that candidates seeking office must understand and respond to their constituents' concerns to maintain support. In an ideal democracy, this creates a feedback loop of representative responsiveness. Representatives act in alignment with voter interests because failing to do so would cost them re-election. Furthermore, in a progressive vision of democracy, constituents' lives ought to be improved as their representatives seek and discover ways to effect such improvements, and then enact them. This vision, however, rests on a crucial assumption, which is that voters can accurately assess their representatives' actions and their consequences. If the electorate is misinformed or manipulated or distracted, this feedback loop fails to function, and representatives can retain power without genuinely serving their constituents. Both causal loops, representative responsiveness and progressive improvement, are made ineffective by what we've been calling attachment to views. First, political grievances are often detached from real policy solutions and instead reified into ideological identities. Voters often support candidates not based on their actions, but on symbolic affiliations, party loyalty, national identity, or cultural values. This misdirects political engagement from practical governance to symbolic battles over identity. There's the dog again. Should I start that sentence again? So voters often support candidates not based on their actions, but on symbolic affiliations such as party loyalty, national identity, and cultural values. This misdirects political engagement from practical governance to symbolic battles over identity and ideology that refuse the insights from alternative perspectives, right? Each side is just looking at their own perspective. Second, the complexity of governance allows manipulation of public perception. In a complex IT-driven globalized economy we've got now, ordinary citizens are more removed than ever from the expert processes that craft policy. The actual effect of policies are often obscured by misinformation, media spin, and corporate influence. Voters may misunderstand the causes of economic downturns, crime rates, or job losses, and may blame or credit politicians based on narrative convenience rather than empirical evidence. This distortion is not accidental. Politicians are incentivized to cultivate a carefully managed public image rather than genuine policy success. As a result, elections become contests of perception rather than assessments of effective governance. The ideal cycle where politicians can earn re-election by improving constituents' lives is replaced by a cycle of media-driven image management where success depends more on narrative control than real policy impact. In such an environment of reified doctrinal perspectives, demonization and polarization isolate competitors both from one another and from frank assessment of their policies. For democratic representation and progressive improvement to function as they should, the electorate needs to be able to discern between political reality and manufactured perception. And the key structural defect in many modern democracies then is the gap between voter understanding and actual governance. When that gap is large, democracy functions more as a symbolic exercise than a mechanism for political accountability. The more people are encouraged to appeal to abstractions, though, the more they can be manipulated by the defilements. That's Mara's hook. This gap has always existed to some degree, but historically it's been bridged by trust in institutions. Citizens relied on political parties, media, and civic organizations to interpret complex issues, but former trust in institutions has eroded, leaving identity-based partisanship and ideological narratives to fill the void. In a system where voters lack the tools to assess policy effectiveness, representatives appeal to voters' biases rather than their interests, sustaining power through rhetoric rather than results. Populist movements effectively capitalize on this gap and seek to eliminate it by demonizing government processes that are not widely understood. We just eliminate the parts of the government that we don't understand. From a Buddhist-inflected perspective, the real issue is not the decline in trust itself, but the conditions that make trust necessary. A system that depends on trust in politicians' honesty or the media's integrity will always be vulnerable to manipulation. Asked by a challenger whether he really believed in the Dharma of the Buddha, one monk said, no, he didn't believe it. He knew it through direct awareness, the fruit of his meditation. A more robust democratic model would help voters cultivate direct understanding rather than relying on trust, so that voters could see and assess government actions for themselves. Even if the Buddha can't be fully trusted, politicians certainly can. Sorry, say that again. It's not what I said. If even the Buddha can't be fully trusted, see, you really got to read the words in order in English. If even the Buddha can't be fully trusted, politicians certainly cannot be trusted to be fully fundamentally right. No one can claim more than a perspective, one available option among many. The less destructive way to close the gap between voter understanding and sophisticated governance then, and so make governments more democratic, would be to vastly improve general education. In the modern world, education for democracy for democratic representation must go beyond procedural knowledge of how government functions to provide facility in direct engagement with the complexities of policy and governance. And that's really what I think we have to do. Ideally, an informed electorate should be able to understand the reasoning behind policy decisions rather than just their political branding. Average voters should be capable of evaluating whether representatives have fulfilled their promises using real-world evidence. Everyone should be able to distinguish ideological narratives from measurable outcomes in governance. This requires widespread education in political literacy, focusing on how government policies work, how economic and legal systems operate, and how to critically assess political claims. If we would like to deploy the best of historical and social science research to affect policy, which it already does or did until a few months ago, we need everyone to have some understanding of these fields. Without this foundation, democracy risks being reduced to a ritual of electoral participation divorced from substantive governance. There are many ways to make this, to take this analysis, but some obvious directions would be: one, more transparent mechanisms of governance, allowing citizens to track political decision-making; educational policy projects that emphasize developing citizens as critically engaged with government policy rather than just passive consumers of political rhetoric and ideological partisanship; and promoting a media landscape that prioritizes clarity of argumentation and evidence over ideological entertainment, resisting the pressures of sensationalism and spin or outright lies. Again, seems obvious, but it's a big ask. Despite its flaws, democracy remains a powerful mechanism for social progress, but only when its institutions align with representation with reality. From a Buddhist perspective, this alignment requires clear awareness of cause and effect, rejecting reified identities and ideological entrenchment, in favor of pragmatic adaptive governance. In a fully realized democracy, citizens would not need to trust representatives as individuals. They'd simply need access to the information necessary to verify political claims and assess policy outcomes. This shift would move democracy away from personality-driven populism and toward a more mindful, empirical approach to governance. If mindfulness is the individual practice of holding off from reifying abstractions in favor of seeing things as they are, a well-functioning democracy should cultivate a collective version of this awareness, ensuring that policies are assessed by their actual effects, not their symbolic appeal. This would mean expanding civic education, institutional transparency, and epistemic humility in governance, as I said. A democracy that functions not just procedurally, but practically, pragmatically, attuned to empirical conditions rather than ideological fictions, would be more resilient, more responsive, and more capable of genuine progress. So this vision is ambitious and may seem utopian, but I consider it genuinely practicable if it's adopted as a significant mission by modern universities and public media working together and using the new AI tools now that everything is completely changing. Okay, so this is the conclusion. You probably already know my conclusion. I'll try to finish quickly. I began by emphasizing the Buddhist moral psychological picture, according to which social identities and roles overwhelm the mind with defilements, particularly through attachment to views and the selective reification of perspectives. We saw that mindfulness meditation provides an ethical and epistemic counterweight, enabling distance from ideological and identity-based distortions. In seeking to apply this to politics, we saw that the Buddha's renunciant community demonstrates that social identities are optional, which models a form of social mindfulness and points us toward the notion of optionality as a corrective for political thought in general. Political structures, especially democracies, often fail when perspectives become rigid and ideological rather than pragmatic and empirically grounded. Awareness of optionality, we saw, can counteract political polarization, helping revise and expand Deweyan democratic education to focus on adaptability, epistemic humility, and empirical reasoning. So that's all stuff I've said now 2 or 3 times. While personal practice, for example, meditation, can cultivate an awareness of optionality and could make great transformative changes if practiced on a wide scale, a significant challenge for political thought would be how to design political institutions that embed this awareness structurally. How can we address the problem that governments and public opinion systems tend to reify themselves, leading to self-perpetuating ideological rigidity? I see possible allies for this view in reflexive governance systems and deliberative democracy models. In reflexive governance systems, institutions are structured to self-correct by embedding mechanisms for regular reassessment of policies. So familiar methods are term limits, sunset clauses of various kinds, so that everything has to be renegotiated again and again. Ensuring transparency in decision-making and integrating feedback loops that allow for the revision of structures based on empirical outcomes rather than ideological commitments. In deliberative democracy models, democratic systems incorporate sustained reflection and adaptation by implementing structured deliberative forums, citizen assemblies, and iterative policy reviews that require engagement with multiple perspectives before decisions are finalized. So you just have more human beings involved, more perspectives that way. In general, the Buddhist-inflected pragmatic approach I'm proposing suggests that political systems should not merely administer existing identities and ideologies, but cultivate a culture of reflection, adaptability, and epistemic humility. The next step would be to explore practical ways to institutionalize optionality, ensuring that political structures evolve in response to actual conditions rather than rigid ideological commitments. That's where I am. Thank you. So I'll take questions. Could open the door even for a dog if it's worth cooling down there a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. So this is how I understand your talk. I think the talk is based on the message that one should take the action of being self-critical, like moral psychology, right? Like being because of our moral sense, maybe one should or one criticizes the identities one received from social norms, and mindfulness one should be critical of all like conceptual reifications. So the action of being critical, uh, like what comes before and what comes after, what makes one, what provokes one to take the action of being critical. How is it assumed that humans are like ethical agents that they just do this, or if you say one should be ethical or one should practice mindfulness, what provokes like one to do so? And also this, so this is what comes after the action, and what comes before the action, what comes after the action. So to take the action of being self-critical, ideally, it has no end, right? To until one reaches maybe the end of being self-critical of the action itself, being self-critical. So there's no end of being self-critical. So in that sense, this action is to be deconstructive. So how can it serve as the basis for construction of anything, like for example Buddhist inspired pragmatism? Why why should we stop at Buddhist inspired pragmatism instead of being take the action all the way through?
Thanks. So I think this is very common to ask these kinds of questions about what I'm saying, and I want to be very clear that it's not possible. It would be very inconsistent for me to say that I have a doctrine that everyone should adopt. What I have is some observations about human behavior, human psychology, human societies, and history. And when I talk about it, a lot of people agree that we have certain types of problems, and that one of the problems that the Buddha seems to have identified, it has to do with the way that the mind functions, and that maybe that's the, it turns out to be a really surprising number of problems emerge in this way from, and so you can see why people would end up being religiously Buddhist because it's so comprehensive. But I'm not claiming that. I'm not saying people should be religiously Buddhist. I'm saying that there's a ton of really useful, pragmatic advice in the Buddhist tradition to bring out when we're analyzing cultural forms, when we're also analyzing our own setup. So the question is, you're asked from a kind of like height, your question, right? Looking down on the idea, and you're asking kind of like, how could it possibly work? Like, well, let's try it. And then to the extent that it works, let's keep trying it. And if it doesn't work, let's be aware of where the ways that it works and where are the ways that it doesn't work. So I brought up the whole section on psychology to make the point that actually it's tended to really convince almost the entire field of psychology that mindfulness practice is like a really useful tool for people in trying to understand their own minds and in trying to get a hold of their moral actions, and to live more in a more satisfying way. So that's, I think, not decisive. It doesn't prove everything, but it does show the kind of possibility for applying this set of ideas more widely. And it might motivate you to be like, oh, actually, if humans are operating according to this kind of structure that the Buddhists have described, or at least if that's a useful way of looking at the way that the mind operates, then maybe it's got application in thinking about societies, because societies are made of humans. And so the process that I'm trying to promote is one of investigation, curiosity, and not one that says like, I have the solution to all things. But I do feel like we're in a situation where like there aren't a lot of very good options that have proven to be the right one. Then let me say that again, nothing is right now. Nobody feels even very confident about any kind of doctrinal system that's going to explain things. That situation is a good one for the Buddhists to move in because they don't even have one. This is the way I'm saying, like they don't have a social system that we want. We just have ways of critiquing tendencies. And so using that perspective, just noticing where are people doing stuff that everybody can see is wrong, and why are they doing that? Trying to understand that as a motivated action with a certain type of delusion behind it. That's really helpful to look at society this way. So actually, Dan, when he introduced me, mentioned that I'm writing a book. I don't know if he mentioned I'm writing a book about society and politics. These ideas. But I've also got a series coming out. I'm not the only person working with these ideas. We have a series coming out. I think it's going to start being published in August at the Imminent Frame, which you may know. It's an online journal. A series of authors writing on the topic of what we're calling karmic historiography. And the idea is just to sort of try to bring karma into a kind of social science world and to look at history from the perspective of basically to what degree are historical actions, cultural forms, something that we can judge using this kind of a lens. Can we look at, for instance, the collapse of a political party being connected to their adoption of lying as a norm, something like that. That would sort of fit with a kind of Buddhist karmic reading of certain types. So the question is, what kinds of readings like that can we do? And then to try and build. So anyway, there's going to be a really nice series of great articles coming out. Don't miss it in August. Next question. Sorry, I spoke for too long on that probably, but yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for a wonderful speech. And I do have a question. When you give a lot of suggestions to the democratic representation, and you told that we should have like a more general education and we need to gain more information to build a better community. But for me, I live in China, and in China, we're not using democracy as our political system. And I want to know, like, especially like I grew up in the Tibetan area in China, and nowadays, especially in high school, we have a standard test called Gaokao, and it's the only test to depend on like, to let student to get into college depends on their scores, and but like China avoiding their access to have the test on Tibet and like they can only learn Mandarin and English nowadays since this year. And I want to know how are we able to like gain more information worldwide and to have a more rational mind and to in order to have a better community because like in China we're not using like elections or anything. We use like representation and I'm really confused. Me and like all of the other high schoolers, the new generation of China, how are we able to change the situation and build a better community to let every people, including the minority like Tibetan, to have the ability to express their expressions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that question. That's a hugely important question. And it's also, I've been told, not really a topic that RYI is generally addressing. But let me just put it in a general way, because I certainly don't want to claim that I have some strategy for you that's really a practical one or a direct one, or that I even have a project in this regard. One way I'm thinking about what I'm doing is I'm trying to create an understanding of certain types of values, a certain way of thinking about what society is, what's it for, how we interact with one another, and how we go wrong as both moral individuals and also as societies. What are the kinds of things that cause problems for society using Buddhist value systems? And to me, just educating people in those values systems and being practical about reading history, reading culture, and reading cultural forms through those systems allows people to see specific nodes of intervention. So I would say one of the things, for instance, that I am writing about in my book, and I've written a short paper about this I could share with you if you want, which is about how there's a kind of pragmatic utility to nonviolent responses that are very different than violent responses, and that this argument fits with a kind of Buddhist understanding of how the opponent in a given situation is also your potential friend, because no one is actually essentially anything, right? So all of our identities that we have adopted, I'm a particular national identity, I'm a particular racial identity. These identities have histories. They have emerged in a particular way in a particular time. And actually, every person who thinks they really are that thing and assigns those identities to others as well is, from Buddhist perspective, deluded to the extent that they're reifying it. And so the question is trying to understand how we can understand the possibility of people who are our enemy now as being our friend in the future, and what would have to change in order for that to occur. Anyway, more broadly, even more generally, I'm trying to articulate these kinds of ideas and views, and then everyone everywhere needs to figure out for themselves how they apply. I think this is the way that values ought to work. There's a lot of potential applications here, but I don't know what all the details would be.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for wonderful lectures. So I recently read a book from recently retired justice from Supreme Court, and he wrote about pragmatism and textualism, and he said that almost the majority of the Supreme Court, like the court right now, they're applying the textualism. So I would be grateful to see how you could apply your pragmatism idea in your new book. And my question is that from my experience in Nepal right now, many rituals I saw actually amplified attachment to certain view, from my opinion. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, how Buddhism or Buddhist community maintain the pluralism rather than the idolatry?
Yeah, so thank you. That's just to the second point, I think that I have, it's not part of this paper, but Buddhist traditions have not worked according to the particular, Buddhist polities historically have not adopted the values that I'm trying to put forward as a kind of Buddhist conceptual structure for understanding how humans could be, understanding their optionality. It's just not, and also on the contrary, right? You have reification of identities, you have nationalisms. And so I don't think that just being Buddhist is a criterion for having the values system that I'm trying to promote. It's certainly not. I think people tend to think that or it's very common for people to think that kind of the idea of searching for meaning in life is about trying to figure out what the right religion is to a certain degree. And then once you've got that, then you know how to act. But actually, once you have a religion, you have a whole repertoire of ways to act. every religious tradition has people acting in the whole way, all the various methods, all the various kinds of results. So every religion has people, justifying nationalism and acting non-violently and saving lives. And also every religion has, people reifying identities and people questioning identities. Those resources are available in all the traditions. So Buddhism is no different. I think Buddhism has some ideas, and I think many Buddhists are reciting a lot of words that to me resonate with the ideas that I'm putting forward, but that doesn't mean that people are necessarily internalizing those ideas, certainly not the way that I'm articulating them. As to the Supreme Court, sure, let's talk about that sometime, but again, I'm not claiming to be expert in every domain. People need to have, I would ask my dad, but when I have legal questions, I ask my dad. But it is true that to me, the reification of text as if it was kind of set and you could just tell what the text meant in a particular time goes against both my understanding of particular the way that law has to function and has to change because times change and things change, and also goes against my understanding of texts. There's always interpretation in texts, and every generation reads texts in different ways, and so that would be my general position, is that pragmatism is kind of the only reasonable way to go about. But that's a very abstract answer to your question.
How would you, is this one? Okay. How would you respond to a more radical individual who might posit that violence or the threat of violence is inherent to governance, and as a result, to win these reforms that you kind of advocate for, violence wielded by, or the threat of violence wielded by the oppressed is necessary? Would you say that this ideology or this way of viewing these values, which put avoiding the defilements first, would reject the violence of the oppressed?
Yeah, so you're asking me about the other paper that I didn't deliver, which is the one on nonviolence. But in general, to bring it back to the topic at hand, I would say that it sounds like your first question is, what do you say about a particular reified understanding of social structures that require that people act violently and give them actually not just an excuse, but a motive to act violently when they've been oppressed in a particular way, and that if they can see in the world that they've been treated in a particular way, they get to be violent, even if normally they wouldn't think violence is a good thing. They should think that. That seems to me like an example of a kind of what Tolstoy calls the broom that sweeps away personal responsibility from the people who are choosing violence. That doesn't mean that it's not, in a sense, pragmatically true. And that would be something we'd need to argue, research. So I would say that I would want to suspend certainties like that, but also, propose how we research and determine whether that's the case, and what the goals are that are reached by those violent movements or nonviolent movements, and to what degree, that's defensible in a practical way. But there was another point to the question.
That was basically it.
Okay.
Kind of Martin Luther King's logic of riots as the language of the oppressed.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It sounds like to me you're saying that AI as a tool could help ordinary people to have the information to access what you called optionality. And if that's the case, how does Buddhist value system could help with that? And what would that look like? Like a cyber Buddha?
Sorry, I'm not totally sure I heard what you're saying. That, yeah, it was kind of loud.
Alternate have the information to access what you call optionality, and how does this moral framework help us with that, and what would that look like a cyborg Buddha?
What would optionality look like today? Is that what you mean?
No, like AI.
Oh, AI. Oh, yeah. Why am I? Yeah. So how's AI going to help us with optionality? Okay. So I think that actually one of the things that you get from studying history and culture is you understand that your way of seeing the world is yours and not necessary, not general, not the only way that things can be. Studying history, studying other cultures, and traveling are classic ways that people have understood that their way of being in the world is conditioned and is different and distinctive, and also something that other options are available. So I think that definitely the Sangha is one means, but another one is the humanities. Just to educate everyone, make it clear what the cultures of the, how different perspectives are on things. It seems to all of us that we know this fact, that people are different, but we tend to reify those identities, and we think, well, that's the way those people are. That's not the way I am. And so I think the main thing that the study of history and culture does is it helps you see that actually we're all the result of our conditioning. We're all the result not just of like being essentially a certain type of nationality, but actually by being born of certain parents in a particular time, in a particular type of economic situation, and that all the particulars of our conditioning have made us see the world the way that we see it, and that actually learning new ways, learning other ways that other people can see things, can get you out of the rut in which most of us find ourselves. To notice difference. And training people basically in difference is, to me, the most straightforward way. It's sort of what the humanities, what liberal arts education is supposed to do at its best, to give people a sense that actually the way that they were raised, the way that they have traditionally seen things to be, is not the only way. And in fact, they could see wisdom in other people's ways of being, and that I think can lead to people coming up with new ideas.
Yeah, but do you think AI is training your student to think differently, or like in a similar way?
So I think you have to. Right now, AI is a big question mark, and also mostly destructive for education, I think. But I think that it also has possible resources available for education that could really transform. So what one of the things I'm interested in doing is helping people develop scholarship that is not just focused on their individual classrooms, but for public-facing audiences, other classrooms, and other audiences around the world. I think that basically all of our knowledge in the university should be freely available to everyone, everywhere, at every level, and we should provide ramps into everything. And we shouldn't have like the sense that like you have to get straight A's and be this captain of the soccer team just to like get into college and then learn the basics of how the government works, or the basics of like enough social thought to understand why various economic policies work. Okay, sorry, I don't know who's next. Yep. Oh, is there a mic back there?
Is that okay? Thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciated it. And my question maybe is related to the previous answer that you just gave. In the first part of your talk, when you were talking about self-occlusion, I really appreciated in particular how you noted that it's not just our own ideas that reify our identity, but also society pushing back on us, and reinforcing that. And in terms of thinking about higher education these days, I guess I was just starting to think about how even higher education itself can kind of participate in that identity forming process. And there's so much pressure these days on students to be successful in a certain kind of way that one's time in school could even be maybe not reifying the bully identity, but reifying a certain kind of identity.
Yeah.
So I was curious to hear from you, especially as a teacher, how you understand or how you've experienced the classroom, or do you have hope for the classroom as a space that could be counter to that, that could allow for like a really personal exploration of optionality that's not a religious motivation, but just even, political, social motivation.
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with you. And I do think that, so I work at a university which is very prestigious. And as a consequence, students who've gotten into that school have been, a lot of them working their whole lives really, really hard just to get into that school. And so then they are, running and still running as once they're in the door, and they feel like the goal is there's an overwhelming feeling on our campus that, there's a certain type of narrow understanding of success. And I try to convince students, and sometimes I'm successful, but usually I'm not, that, they already got into Princeton and that's going to already be on their CV. So they're going to get a job. They don't need to then get complete straight A's and to beat out every other student in order to succeed in life. And then, therefore they should, consider taking another Buddhism course. So, but the classroom actually I see as, in the humanities at least, as a pretty still a very fruitful place for transformation and exploration. I know that a lot of students are really worried about the grade, and that interferes with their ability to engage with material. So I actually have tried to do, this is going to be the most radical thing I'm saying in this talk. I do a thing called ungrading, where we actually don't get it. You're involved in your own grading for the course. But and the result is to try and get, the purpose of that is to get the grading out of the relationship between teachers and students, and to create basically a conversation where everyone's actually exploring and trying to pursue love of learning and self-transformation, instead of trying to impress and beat out other students. So that's a project that I think is ongoing for our classrooms. But I do see it as still like, reading together and stuff that you have never thought of before is still, I think, the best way to help people think new thoughts. There's a mic. Yeah, there's one here.
Yeah, hello. I'm from the United States, and as you are, and I'm just extremely concerned about where we're at as a body politic, so to speak. It feels like almost a complete breakdown at this point. And I'm just wondering what your perspective is on that, any suggestions. And I was also thinking, when I first came in, are there any political models or countries or states that you feel really are doing well? I don't know, it's sort of a silly question in a way, but
yeah, that's a tough one. Thank you. No, I don't mean to be. It's not silly. It's just you're looking for optimism. And I am actually an optimist. In general, I try to find sort of what's the way that we might get through this. But I'm also very, very concerned about America. It's impossible to. I'm also American, and it's impossible to feel that it's anything but a terrible crisis right now. And so the one thing I did mention in the talk that I do want to underline is that I think everything is changing. So maybe that's always the case for, from a Buddhist perspective, that's just basic fact number one about reality, is that all things are impermanent. But I think that with the advent of AI and the shifting of technologies We really don't know what politics is going to look like in 10 years. I think that we also don't know what education is going to look like. We don't know what jobs are going to look like. So all of that just makes me feel not hopeful, because I think that it's, possible that we'll all fall off, an even worse cliff. But but at least that the potential I don't see a way to, directly solve the current crisis, but I don't think that it's going to be solved with the current technologies. So this is why I'm kind of emphasizing, I think the universities and public media should be using AI and getting ahead of it and trying to put into this new technology a means of bringing everyone into the conversation and educating everyone. I think that's an option, at least, for dealing at the ground level. I mean, I don't know. I'm not knowledgeable enough about American politics and history but I certainly have opinions because everyone sits around and talks about this stuff all the time in America. So what I would say, sort of a thumbnail, is that we've allowed education to decline and falter, and we've allowed lying to be a kind of standard in public conversation. And I think that AI can help change that, and maybe other strategies can be put forward to help change that.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I think my question has two parts. So the first one, like historically speaking, the Buddhist value has already, every time they were already integrated in the politics. So if you look at the Tibetan history and also look at the Chinese history and as well as the Japanese history, so how do you see the differences? Your moral, the Buddhist moral psychology that you are proposing to the politics is different than the traditional way of integrating Buddhist value in politics. And also, like in recent years, like maybe in a few decades, even the Dalai Lama has started to talk about the secular Buddhism. So how would you differentiate your proposal with that?
Yeah, so I mean, how is my view different from the Dalai Lama's view is the second one. I mean, my view is very much indebted to the Dalai Lama's view. I think that my view is very much the result of my trying to work up and integrate his view in ethics for the new millennium into something that fits with contemporary social thought and my understanding of traditional readings of Buddhist texts. But it's only one part of it. It's not the whole thing. So I don't see it as in conflict with the Dalai Lama's more secularized understanding and approaches to Buddhism. I should probably, credit the Dalai Lama more often, but I don't want to claim to be saying, putting forward the Dalai Lama's view, which is it's really not like that. I'm just influenced by his work. The critiques of traditional Buddhist politics, I think it's very easy to critique religion and politics. It's a mainstay of the Enlightenment. And so basically the idea that any state that is Buddhist is better than a state that's not, just by virtue of having a lot of Buddhists or just by having a lot of stupas or something like that, is just, reification of a certain type of identity. And it's straightforwardly against the kind of approach that I'm putting forward. That said, there's ways that Buddhist thinkers in various times have actually adopted and promoted some of the views that are in line with what I'm saying. I think it's been tried from a theory perspective by a variety of thinkers in China in the early 20th century, but there's some scholars who've worked on this, but I don't think it's exactly it's never been adopted by Buddhist institutions at large, certainly not large political units. So the kind of approach, I mean, maybe the Dalai Lama himself, in a way, is an advocate of this kind of an approach, but with a particular angle of approach. So there's a variety of ways that I would, critique certain, past Buddhist polities, but that might mistakenly give the impression that Buddhism is different from every other religion in that way.
Okay, just briefly, David Loy, a Buddhist scholar who's very interested in social and political implications of Buddhism in the modern world, pointed out that until recently, most Buddhist countries had very authoritarian ruling regimes. And that therefore, to the extent that the Sangha was dependent on the permission or the patronage of the ruling elites, they were not allowed to have a systematic critique of the social and political status quo. They would lose their funding, they would be suppressed, they would be killed. And so this is not really allowed to flourish in traditional Buddhist countries until fairly recently. And even so, in many places, it's not really totally allowed. And so one of the things that this perspective brings is not just sort of the freedom of inquiry and investigation that some parts of the world enjoy more than others, but the disciplines of the social sciences. How are we going to empirically investigate things? You need to have freedom of information. You'd be able to survey. You need to be able to quantify all kinds of things. And the problem, of course, with much of our social science is its own little silos, as we say. It's its own little privileged discourse, and it doesn't have a larger overarching sort of moral framework, which is what I think the Buddhists bring to this, but can now incorporate the humanities and the social science as well. And I think this is a really new possibility that we have here. And John and I have talked about this a lot. So
yeah, thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. Yeah, Bill's work is also very important and helpful on a lot of these same topics. So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful and stimulating and thoughtful talk.